and welcome to the What If We Think Differently podcast. Here, we reimagine our realities. But this one is a very special episode. We are here with Tendai, not just for another conversation, but we are talking about his latest book. And must I say that this is actually his 6th book. Tendai, welcome to the show on a different agenda today.
Really? Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I like the really. Yeah. Yes, really. Today we are looking at his book here, and it's Shifts in the Land and Agrarian Question in Africa. I will start with a very simple question. What led to the writing of this book?
So this book is a bit of me going back literally to what I may say my academic roots. Mm-hmm. I was born in a semi-peasant household, and I mean it this way. We were migrants. We had an urban home and a rural home. Mm-hmm. Depending on the seasons, you'd find us in the rural area and in the urban areas. I was educated in the urban areas, but our livelihood was also produced. We used to produce our own maize that we would take to the city Bulawayo. So I grew up with a very keen sense of the importance of land and production on the land. Mm-hmm. Then academically, over the years, I found myself always attracted to the idea of studying things to do with agricultural policy, land policy, etc. For my master's, I did a master's on food security in Zimbabwe. Then for my PhD, I looked at emerging forms of social organization in newly resettled areas of Zimbabwe. This was after Fast Track. And I worked at a center that was focused on agrarian studies for a couple of years before I moved into philanthropy. So for me, this book is a homecoming of sorts, coming back to my roots, rediscovering, reconnecting with the debates, reconnecting with what is being written. I had taken, I would say maybe a 5 or 6 year sort of detour, gone to other things, looked at philanthropy, looked at development broadly, looked even at financial inclusion, many other topics. But this felt like it was about time. I was sensing that African scholarship of my generation was beginning to thin. I was not seeing a lot of scholars that I learnt with who are in academia, still writing about this in Zimbabwe and across. And so it sort of led to me to say, what if I put together? That's why I was shocked when you said this is a different kind of conversation. Was it still what if, Yes. So it was what if I explore these things. There were a couple of writings that I had not published, etc., etc., etc. Mm-hmm. But these were issues that were sort of bothering me. So I felt like the best way is to really come back and do some time and just put together something.
All right, lovely. I would like to start with a quote from chapter 2 of this book. And chapter 2 is themed The Land Question in Africa.
Okay.
Is there any purpose or reason for land reform in the 21st century? Is equitable access to land an important condition for Africa's development? In other words, does land still have a role to play in ensuring Africa's development? I think this ties in so well to reimagining the future of Africa and just what we speak about almost on every episode that we have.
Yeah, it's very provocative, right?
Very.
Yeah, and the reason why I would throw something like that at the beginning of a chapter is if you go back into the literature, there've been a number of studies that have challenged the sort of orthodox way of looking at resolving the land and agrarian question as the first step of development. Mm-hmm. So others wrote of the end of peasantries, etc., etc., trying to make it look like the rural question in Africa does not play a role in us imagining Africa's future. To begin to say, in its unresolved form, we should just abandon it and move on. And many people speak of the large-scale migration of Africans from the rural to the urban. Mm-hmm. So they say Africa is the fastest urbanizing continent.
Right.
But in it, we also hide a statistic to say 55 to 58% of our people are still rural.
In rural areas,
Despite the fast urbanization that we're doing, the majority of our people are still rural. But if you follow the news, the conversations around Africa, If you're not careful, you will miss that. Because these are the hidden people that we don't see in policy, we don't see in many debates, etc. The rural question. So I throw that question in a provocative manner to say, in the 21st century, do we behave like other continents to say we don't have a rural problem? Because definitely, for me, I know, but I'm trying to say to you, pause and think, do you still think it's something that we have to resolve? Because if you look at many countries' development agendas, the rural, in terms of issues to do with tenure and everything, is ignored. It does not feature. We talk about financial inclusion, we talk about poverty reduction, we talk about climate change, we talk about formalization. But really, do you see a strategy centered on saying, for this country to develop, let's use Zambia, we will first of all fix the rural question? No, we don't do that.
We never start there. Now, let's take a look at some of the stats that are in this book. And this is chapter 1. It says, when Africa attained independence, it was self-sufficient and even a net exporter of food products. Almost 1.3 million tons a year between 1966 and 1970. Now, let's move it to the future. As of 2021, Africa's total value of food imports registered roughly 100 billion against exports of 60 billion. Those are some staggering statistics. And what a shift.
Yeah, so we now have a 40 billion food deficit, if you put it in monetary terms. So for us to survive as Africa, we need to set aside 40 billion every year to import food. And I think the figures have gone up because the prices of grain, etc., with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, grain has gone up slightly. But I want to come back to say, what explains 1966 and 1970? That period where we say Africa is a net exporter. And yet, it's the time when Africa is decolonizing. It's a time when other African countries are actually still under colonial rule. But at that moment, we find ourselves in a place whereby Africa is a net exporter of food. So it has to do with the policies that were being introduced by decolonizing countries, Ghana and many others, Tanzania, etc., that were really focused on and zeroed in on the rural question and made sure that production was sort of there were subsidies. So if you look at budget spend on the rural question during that period, it was higher. So we're spending close to 20 to 25% on agricultural development. Our expenditure on things like extension, support, etc., was significant. But if you fast forward to the structural adjustment days, agricultural support disappears from budgets. It comes down to something like 2%. We're spending less than 1% in some instances on agriculture subsidies, because the mantra at that time, the mantra of the day, driven by World Bank and related institutions, is to say subsidies are bad for your agriculture. They are to say that you need to work from your position of comparative advantage. So in the process, we remove the subsidies, and in some instances, we actually destroy the government-owned grain boards that were responsible for supporting production and then buying the produce from the farmers. So we destroy even the markets. So smallholders are made to move from one commodity to another. If you look at Kenya, for instance, that's when you begin to see where smallholders were doing very well in tea. But because of what is happening globally and also the lack of subsidies, we begin to see smallholders banning their tea estates and beginning to move into other crops. In Zimbabwe here, where they had a maize miracle in the 80s, the first decade of independence, where our Neocosmos and others, and even the government, coined it the maize miracle because our production shot up 100% soon after independence. But we begin to see in the 1990s, with the removal of subsidies, we're now struggling with producing enough food. And there are many other factors to do with droughts. Our agriculture remains rainfall dependent, etc. But it's a sorry state to say that in the 21st century, in 2021, we actually have this deficit. Yet you would have thought that would have closed the deficit, given the fact that Africa has got more arable land compared to any other continent as we speak. And Africa has got a youth dividend. It's bulging in the middle. So we could be using that labor in the rural areas to produce. So the question is, because you didn't further ask the question, because I then asked the provocative question, if I'm correct to say, have Africans become lazy?
Yes, you do.
So we're just being provocative, because I think Africans are actually working harder. The Africans are working harder today. Smallholders are working harder because they're having to fetch water, they're having to do other things by themselves. So in terms of labor contribution, it's gone up, but the output is less. So that's the real issue. So when you begin to factor that, you begin to say, what has gone wrong? I think number one is government policy. Number two is the manner in which Africa is inserted into global commodity value chains. Because if in the 1970s we're producers of primary goods, and in 2021 we're still producers of primary goods, that means we have not made the shift. Every other region has made the shift towards a more sophisticated value chain where they are producing, they are doing what I call the next step. For every agricultural commodity, there's a next step. If it's coffee, maybe it's roasting it, it's packaging it. For maize meal, maybe instead of just exporting bags of maize, if it's tobacco, maybe it's the cigar industry, cigarettes, etc. For everything we're producing, we're not doing the +1 approach. We're still producing and marketing as if we're in the 1960s.
Right.
And yet, for all those goods that we produce, the prices are not determined in Africa. Coffee, the price of coffee is not determined in Africa. It's determined at the Global Coffee Exchange based in London. Cocoa is the same. It's not determined in Ghana and Ivory Coast, despite the fact that these are the two largest producers globally of cocoa. They are price takers, they're not price setters. So somebody else sets the price. And if you look at the difference, there's a study that was done to say the price of cocoa, when it shifts from Ghana and Ivory Coast just to places where it's then developed into chocolate, it has already improved by over 100%, just by shifting, going to another zone. Right. So the price you pay here and the price you pay there are different. The only thing that they've done is ship it. That's the challenge that we face.
All right, so I would like to bring the conversation back to the actual land question, because I know some people, you've put two questions here together, the land question and the agrarian question. I would like to get into if you can actually separate those two. But I was reading some content around the land question, agrarian question, and Sam Moyo, who I know you worked very closely with, talks about the redistribution question for Africa and not necessarily the agrarian question or the land question. But I'll park that for now.
Okay.
You talk about the land question, which really is the ownership. You talk about all these things, the production of things on the land, but what is the role of ownership, land tenure, whether it's freehold or it's, it belongs to small scale farmers? What is the significance of that?
That's a very loaded question. And let me start off with a lighter note. Because I worked with Prof. Sam. I could never call him Sam the way you did.
I read it.
It's fine. I'm just saying, I was like, okay. So I think I was literally sort of brought over to a focus on this by Prof. And this book in some way is in celebration of his legacy. I remember we launched it with colleagues from the institute he used to lead, in celebration of his work, etc. So for me, is to build upon that robust scholarship, although I can never claim to fill his shoes because he was larger than life. I think the issue you're talking about is actually central to the land question. Well, other scholars will say there's no land and agrarian question, there's just an agrarian question. And within the agrarian question, there's a land question. But for us to really sort of dissect this, I always prefer to separate them because I can explain what I mean by the agrarian question. But the land question in Africa is in two ways. There are countries that went through what we call settler colonialism. Kenya, Zimbabwe, Namibia, South Africa. These ones, land was taken, vast tracts of land were taken from locals and were expropriated by the colonizers. And we had 2 or 3 forms of agriculture that happened. There was agriculture that they called commercial agriculture. It was associated with large-scale agriculture, large farms, etc., etc. And also it was, over time, it became highly mechanized.
Right.
And over time, it looked as if it was the one that was meant to be the business sector. Then the majority of the locals were in what we called customary or communal land, but customary tenure. And in it, you have now got these two systems. On the one hand, the person who's owning the large-scale piece of land is on freehold title. That means he's got a piece of paper that says he owns land from this border to that border to this border to this border. It's his land. He can take that piece of paper and go to the bank easily and say, I would like financing for my crop. This is my piece of land which I bring to you as a guarantee. In the customary lands, land is not owned individually, is owned through belonging. You belong to a family, so I belong to the Murisa family. So my claims on land depend on what my ancestors had. So if my ancestors did not have land, I also don't have land. So they may cut a piece for me. So now, given all the dynamics around resettlement, etc., the sizes that different African families own in terms of land vary. But in the majority of cases, they were very small plots. And over time, because it's customary land that is accessed through inheritance, if I have children, I have to cut out some pieces of my own land to my children, and they'll do the same for their children. Right. So land sizes get smaller and smaller. But also there's no title. I cannot use that. It's not recognized by banks as security. Right. So this is the predominant form of land ownership in Zimbabwe and across many African countries, except for Kenya. Kenya recognizes private tenure, even for smallholders. So Kenya has done something that is somewhat different than Mozambique, Tanzania, and Zambia tried the World Bank driven models around land leases, land titling, having a title to land, then you'll have a lease, then you could use that title to sort of access loan or financing. But in the majority of cases, our people in the rural areas eke out an existence through customary tenure and belonging.
Right, so how does that feed into then the country's production or ability to produce? How is that affected? So
on the one hand, it creates a burden on the state because these people who are always the majority in the rural areas, you have no access to your financial services sector. So governments are now beholden to offer subsidies. So we see a huge debate in the 90s around the efficacy of subsidies and the others. That's why I was saying that during that period, the World Bank made the argument without really looking at the ways in which people are holding land to say subsidies are inefficient, they should be removed. So many governments went along and removed subsidies. But what changed the narrative was a story from a very little country, Malawi. Bingu wa Mutharika, when he became president, he reintroduced subsidies that President Banda had in place. But these were now different and they were better. But all of a sudden, within 2 years, we begin to see a country that was a net importer of food becoming a net exporter of food. But the burden on the government was huge. Government was spending a lot of money on inputs. And also now, this is the agrarian question. You're fixing production, and you're fixing production without having fixed the land question, right? So now what you're doing as the state, you take on the burden of financing agricultural development. That's one. But also because you are in a non-industrialized country, the inputs you require are manufactured elsewhere. So you begin to need a lot of foreign currency to import fertilizer, a lot of foreign currency to import seeds, and a lot of foreign currency to import pesticides, insecticides, etc. because they're not being produced in Malawi. So many of our African countries may try to deal with production through, I always say, subsidies hide many other inefficiencies. The inefficiency of failing to develop an agro-industrial sector, which is necessary for the takeoff of agriculture.
And I see you kind of separated the land question. You talk about the land agrarian question in general. And then you come back and say the modern
land question.
Land question. What is the difference between those two? When you were writing, what were you trying to differentiate?
So in many instances when we enter the room and you say, I'm here to present on the land question, people always think of us in the past, the colonially driven land questions. The colonially driven land questions here to do with the issues that we have dealt with, the alienation of land and the marginalization of locals, development of this new sector, the estate agriculture sector, large-scale commercial sector, etc., etc. That's the colonially derived land question. Right. The removal of people from their ancestral lands. And related to that is also the insecurities, because I know we don't have time for this. If I went through the modifications of customary tenure and how it was bastardized by the colonial regimes. So when we talk about the land question, people always associate it with those debates. But when I talk about the modern, I talk about it through maybe two rounds. The first round is the discovery of what you may call agrofuels, jatropha and others. And people beginning to say we need to dedicate more land in Africa towards the growth of these plants that can be used for biofuels. So it led then to a new form of land alienation, people being moved from their land so that they could create these new estates for biofuels. So that's the first wave. Then the second wave comes immediately after, when 2008, 2009 were food riots starting in Tunisia and across. And there's actually a global food shortage. I could talk about what the global system was doing, but I know we're limited for time. What then happened is the emerging powers, Qatar, UAE, and many others, began to think of food security in a different way. These are desert country predominantly. They began to think of food security in a different country, to say, we cannot rely on the availability of food on the market. We have to make sure that we get our hands dirty in food production. So they come into Africa. They also purchase vast swaths of land. So you have what you call in Tanzania a green belt, land that is being bought, and people who had never experienced land alienation because there was no settler colonialism in countries like Tanzania, being moved from their places so that they could have these new large-scale commercial farms that are producing food. But different now is they're not producing food for Tanzania. They are producing food for the countries where these investors are coming from. So this is not limited to Tanzania. Zimbabwe has a similar experience. Zambia, many African countries go through this. So that's the second wave of the post-colonial sort of new land questions. And it creates land alienation in countries that had never experienced land alienation at a huge scale. Ghana goes through this. Many countries go through this. Then the third wave is what we're in right now. And it is influenced by a new phenomena called carbon credit, the carbon credit market.
Sinks,
Climate change has led to one of the innovations around is to say we need to keep our forests. And now we're beginning to say, then African countries saying, but at times we need this forest for other developments. Then people say, no, we'll pay you for not using your forest. It's a very simplistic debate, because given the customary nature of our land tenure, boundaries between where people stay and the forest it's not like it's a Chinese wall. People depend on forests. Depend on forests for firewood, depend on forests for fruits from there, depend on forests for many other things, even hunting, etc. But when you're coming with these carbon credits and you are beginning to do carbon sinks, you're purchasing a forest, you alienate people from a livelihood that they were used to. Even the water that they were fetching from there, they're now alienated from it. So that's the third wave. And we're seeing it again happening across Africa. Vast tracts of land are being alienated and being just left seemingly idle, but communities are no longer allowed to tap and to get livelihoods to it. So those are the waves of the post-colonial land question. So, and I think this builds upon Prof. Sam Moyo's work to begin to say, as scholars, we need to keep on alert to the fact that we cannot just stagnate the land question around the colonial nature of it. But even after colonialism, when countries have been liberated, they become free. There are many varying factors. They are usually, as you can see, most of the factors I mentioned are external to Africa. But they still influence land policy, distribution of land, and how people own land.
Great. I would like to read a section from chapter 2. If you buy the book, which is available, it's on page 16. It says, land is a conflict-ridden resource, and due to its many meanings, a sensitive issue in Africa. Disputes and conflicts about land occur at all levels. Conflicts between neighbors about field boundaries, between men, women, and generations about their respective land rights, between pastoralists and farmers, between states and indigenous people, between companies and local populations about rights to exploit mineral and other resources. The question about rights to land and territories has also been the source of civil wars as well as wars between nations. This right here is just a clear indicator of where we are with the land question. If we're looking at 2026 and the wars that are taking place within Africa, and we look at it internationally, you cannot differentiate. You cannot then say it's not a land question.
And did I write that? Yes, I think. But I think this is where, I don't want to call it a frustration, this is where we are challenged, some of us who grapple with the land question, how it's ignored. And yet it is at the center of our existence and the conflicts. And how my frustration is with African governments, how they have not really paid attention to the need to really fix the land tenure issue. Because the challenges we're having, because I always say to people that if you are an investor and you are interested in having a carbon sink, you will not just enter into a European country and alienate people.
Right.
It's because of the manner in which communities here hold land. So if we're to fix and improve tenure security in a way that communities actually have a sense and they've got the right paperwork to defend their land. As at the moment, communal land or customary land, do you know it's normally vested in the president? So if a deal is made at a national level, those in the communal, in the customary lands will just learn that this is what has happened. We have a big issue in Chilonga and Chiredzi around people were being moved so that they can make way for feedstock. People were being moved. People were settled there before colonialism because land is vested in the president, with very limited consultation with communities. And this is not unique to Zimbabwe, it cuts across. So these issues you're talking about, to say, at every level, you ask yourself, all those levels you're talking about, to say, where is the arbitration, where is the conflict resolution mechanism? Are they sufficient? Especially at community level. Have we invested enough in land courts? Have we done enough? Have we done enough in terms of protecting the rights? Was land, maybe I didn't hear you or maybe I forgot. It's inheritance. Land is a big issue in Africa. Land is a big, we even made a huge movie around land in Zimbabwe. So all these things are issues that we need to be discussing.
So this brings me to a memory of a conversation that we once had about citizenship. And we were sitting in a room and you were describing to us the importance of land in regards to citizenship. The fact that I have an ID or birth certificate does not make me a citizen. Could you just, I think it's important for the ordinary person to know why this conversation applies to them as well.
I'm alert to the fact that we're short of time, but I'll say that before the world knew of the current mayor of New York, Mamdani, I knew of his dad, Mahmoud Mamdani. Mahmoud Mamdani wrote a book called Citizen and Subject. And in it, and it was the first time I came across this thinking to say that citizenship is about ownership of property. So even if you look now, even when you go back, you should say, yeah, it makes sense. Because even if you look at the French Revolution and many other revolutions, it was about your recognition has to be based on the landed class. You had land, they were citizens, they could vote, they could do something. That's why in the UK you have a House of Lords. It's based on access to land. But here, when we give people customary tenure, we don't recognize their property. So their property does. So, and one of the reasons why we cite this is to say, customary tenure does not allow you to bring your land to a civil court. Civil court. You can't have that discussion in a civil court. It normally goes to a traditional court. And in a traditional court, you are subjects of the chief. You're not citizens. Well, citizens are treated fairly in what we call civil courts. So that's the issue. But I can go further. That's an episode on its own. But just to say,
we should explore it sometime.
But just to say that tenure determines citizenship. Not your identity. Tenure determines citizenship.
No, it's so easy to sit and be divorced from issues of land because you're now in the city and you think, well, I'm a citizen because I carry my ID. But here we are.
I think that's what electoral democracy has lied to us, because there's a lot to citizenship that has to do with the economic sphere, not political voting.
Right.
Because democracy is anchored in the economic sphere. The equality of participation in the economy is anchored in what resource you have access to. That's how you can say you are in a republic. You have equality of opportunity. But if you are denied using your land and the person next door can use their land to gain a benefit, then surely you're not equal to this person.
Tendai, you keep going deeper. Our time, unfortunately, does not allow us to go that way. Thank you for this discussion. We've only covered half of the book. And in this discussion, we spoke about the land and agrarian question. What is it and why is it important? Why is land important for you and me as citizens? Why is the customary tenure, when we talk about the freehold tenure, what is the difference between those two? Modern question around the land agrarian question, as well as the former question. What are all those elements? Thank you for joining us today, Tendai. Thank you for allowing us to explore this incredible book. We will be back and we will look at other parts of the book. So thank you so much. And they can find this book Online, confirmed?
Online. There's a website with the title of the book, and and also we are trying to make sure that it's available in all online stores. For researchers, I'll give you a tip. Go to researchgate.net. You'll find it. And apologies if I sounded emotional. This is a subject very dear to me, at the center of, I think it's at the center of fixing the African question. To us, the agrarian question is equal to the African question.
African development question. So thank you for joining us. We will see you in the next episode. Goodbye for now. To subscribe, you can look for What If We Think Differently on Spotify. You can also look for What If We Think Differently on Apple Podcasts. On YouTube, you will find us on Cvio TV. To stay up to